Hello and welcome to the final part of the video series on making Pong. So last time we got to the point where we had completed our main menu, we'd added in settings and credits, and we had that working for adjusting our audio volumes. We had also gotten set up our AI for our players. So that was up and running as well, and we were able to we set that up with a bit of an infrastructure so we can customize and tailor that, which is great. So this time around, it's really just focusing on what are some extra little bits that we can add in just to enhance or vary up the game a little bit, and also creating a bit of a foundation there for if you're wanting to dive in and experiment with additional things that you could add to this. So that's what this is all going to be focused on. So let's take a look at some stuff that we can add in. So first thing I really do want to add in is get some post-processing set up, because I would like to be able to be controlling sort of the visual tone a little bit more. So I'm going to set up a post-process volume. As always, I want to set up a post-processing layer. Now, I'm not strictly going to be using much stuff with the layers there, so I don't really need to, but it's a habit that I like to just make sure that I'm always in that habit, because I'm going to make this a global one, and then that goes onto our main camera. We add in our post-process layer, which we can say that is post-processing, so that's good. And then we'll be able to configure our post-processing. So we can tell it to just create a new profile. Then we've got that up and running. And so now we can just adjust that. So if we go to game view, so first thing I want to look at maybe adding in, I think I don't want ambient occlusion, because I don't think that's going to be what I give a good sort of effect in this case. But I want to just test out, just in case I'm wrong, and just see, because I suspect it'll probably not be really visible at all. And it does look like there's, very little, because I turned off a lot of the stuff for shadows and that. So yes, that makes sense that I'm not really seeing any of it. Which is good. I didn't think it would be, even if it was, we had the lighting set so that it would activate, I didn't feel like it was likely to be one that would be particularly effective. Now, vignetting, I do love a good vignetting, but I don't think in this case, because we've got those sort of dark boundaries and that, I don't think we would actually notice it. So I kind of am thinking a little bit of bloom could be interesting. I kind of want to see how that looks in terms of, and we probably with the setup, we would need to, wow, okay. Wondering if these are actually having any effect. Let's test. Let's add an effect that definitely, so if I add in like a color grading, and desaturate the environment. Okay, so that tells us that our post-processing stuff is not actually kicking in. So we've set that to post-process layer. We've got our volume, which we have set to global. There we go. So we needed to make sure it was in the right layer. So let's just check the intensity with the bloom. So we could potentially do some stuff with that. I could see maybe some value with that. Kind of want to check actually the vignetting again, because I have an idea of a possible thing with that, of the vignetting, having that a red, actually a fairly darkish red vignette. I wonder. So we can sort of say, yeah, it's not really going to give a particularly great effect, because we could do stuff and we could offset the center there, and have that happen based upon there being sort of damage, things like of that. we could maybe do that. If we change the roundness of this, let's really ramp it up. And so could maybe get some nice effect with this. That's pretty well centered. Yeah, I wonder if we could maybe get an interesting effect there with that in terms of as we get closer to victory. But yeah, it doesn't feel like it would be an amazing effect there. Possibly some motion blur could be quite good. When the ball's moving really rapidly, that could be an interesting one. And if I start this up, so we can customize our post-processing while it's actually running. And let's sort of see there with the motion blur, if we ramp up the number of samples, so I get a huge effect from it. It seems like a little bit of an effect. We can change things like the shutter angle and that a bit as well. I'll just tell it to play again so we can easily be messing with it. Let's change the shutter angle right down. So I don't really get a huge effect with it, I'll be honest. Pretty, I would say pretty minimal with it there versus not. And this is the thing, it's always good with the post-processing just to sort of test and see how the different effects are working, whether or not they're giving much of an effect. They've got ambient occlusion there. Good. Figured that should still not have any effect, so that's great. Let's take a look at other effects. So we could do stuff in terms of maybe a little bit of film grain could be interesting. We can ramp up the intensity there. So obviously that would be way too intense. I think monochromatic would look a little bit better. So we could have a little bit, make it sort of feel a little bit old school and grainy sort of effect there. But again, it doesn't make a huge level of impact. We could ramp it up as the game gets more intense, but really it doesn't give us a huge sort of benefit with that. We could look at potentially things like depth of field and all, but again, I don't think we're likely to see a huge level of benefit and effect with it. Color grading could be an interesting one in that we could apply a bit of tinting there. I think could be interesting. We could, using saturation, bring this back to be a fully monochromatic. Could be interesting, of having essentially like a sort of a classic mode option. But again, it doesn't give us a huge sort of benefit there. I'm interested in a bit of bloom potentially, but in particular bloom at I think something that's a warmish color could be interesting. And again, we can just adjust the settings a little bit. Nah, I kind of actually like that. And the reason I like that is I think it just adds a nice sort of visual tone to it. It sort of, I feel, draws things back in a little bit more. And this would also allow us to, material-wise, these paddles, we could actually give them a little bit of emission. We could also set up a material for the ball, because we haven't previously given it its own dedicated material. So I think we give it a dedicated material will help out a little bit. And then I think we turn on a little bit of emission, not a huge amount, So we can base it off of the color for the paddle. I think will work. And this might just help with sort of keeping track of it. So 60, 80, 100. Excellent. So let's just bring that over 60, 80, 100. And I kind of like that. I feel like that helps it stand out a bit more. This will be similar, 80, 100, 100. Bit of emission, 80, 100, 100. So that one, we need to, I think I've gotten the wrong value there for this. So that paddle, that one was 60 for the hue. I've copied the wrong values over. That should be 120 that I'm bringing over for the emission for the, not for the goal, for the paddle. So make that 120. That's better. So that helps that stand out quite nicely. I do like that. And then I think with the ball, we would do similar. Let's see how that looks, because this then could be interesting to then desaturate that a little bit as well. So the ball, and I think with that, if we're doing that, the ground, we would make the ground darker. And I think the ball, we can do stuff to make it stand out a little bit more. Because I think its emission, at the moment, is fairly low. But there, if we brighten that up a bit. So that kind of creates a little bit of that effect from, you know, the old school TVs that this would be played on, where there is sort of that real intensity to the brightness there that we'd experience. And so I actually kind of want to chuck in the color grading a bit now. I think with that bloom, a bit of color grading, and I think a bit of desaturating it, I think could work. And obviously this is to sort of personal taste. I really kind of like that. I think the paddles, I would look at ramping up the saturation on their colors, because I think that will have those colors come through a bit more strongly. Maybe not that bright, so kind of like that actually. I think that works. Just these colors, make them stronger again. Similar with these. That's up there, and I think did really like that level. That looks quite good. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how these visuals are now looking for this. That bit of sort of desaturating it. And I think I'd want to just test with playing it to make sure it's not really sort of impairing being able to play it. I mean, it's not going to impair my ability at playing, because my ability at playing is not amazing. But I quite like that. So that I'm pretty happy with. I think there's further things we could be adding into this though. So I think a useful thing potentially to add into this, just as a way of like, okay, well let's sort of go for this being a little bit more colorful in terms of what it does. And in this case, I mean colorful in terms of, well, a different sort of essentially game mode, where we could have objects that get spawned in here, and then those being spawned has a effect. So what I want to do is I am going to set up a cube. So this is going to be item spawn zone, just as an easy way for me being able to define this. It's going to be, I'm going to put this in another layer. One zone. And so it'll go into that spawn zone layer. It'll be a trigger. I'm going to modify the physics settings. So nothing interacts with spawn zone, because I want nothing to interact with it at all. So I've got my spawn zone here. I'm just going to set this up where this is just an easy way for me controlling things being able to, where they actually can spawn, and for being able to randomly pick locations in there. So we don't want to spawn, I think, too close to the players. So I think probably that's as close as I would want to potentially have stuff spawn. And then that feels like a pretty good bounds for stuff spawning. Pretty happy with that. Okay, so that's the item spawn zones. And then our game manager is going to need to know what mode it's running in. So it's going to need to know. And for this, I'm going to set up num e-game mode, classic, and then a with items mode. I just want to be able to control this. So serialize field, e-game mode. Now we will default to classic. I also want to have the spawn zone there. So for that, I actually just want it to rect. So spawn rect. What's the item spawn rect? So I don't want to, I don't need any of the other things on it. I really just need that rect object that it has. Actually, sorry, I need the collider. And from that I can get the bounding rectangle for it. So the collider, and I'll specifically use the box collider. Item spawn zone. There we go. Rect would have worked well for just 2D, and I probably could lay out a 2D object there, but that's more suited for UI. I think just a collider is going to be suitable for this. So we can link this up. Mode classic, so I'm going to switch the mode to with items. And this would be where what I would actually have is I think I would have a... no, I think it can go under the game manager. I think at this stage it's not too much of a stretch for it to be under the game manager. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder for items, and I think I want these to function as stuff that can be applied onto the particular paddles, so that there's stuff that affects initially what happens with the paddles, but we could have stuff that applies in other locations as well. So I want to have base item, actually, sorry, I want to have interactable item, so that'll be the actual thing that gets interacted with, and then I want to have a script that is going to be for the item effect. So base item effect, and then the one effect that I'm going to chuck in is item effect controls. So I want to put in an effect that what it will do is it will muck up the player's controls. So if you hit it, it mucks up the controls for the other player. Because I think that could be a really interesting effect there. Especially when you then look at how you want the AIs to handle it. Okay, so we're going to have our items. So let's just create a sphere. And the sphere will be the item prefab. So this is going to be the item, and this will be the control purse. So this will muck up the controls. So it's going to have our interactable item on it. So it knows it's going to be able to be impacted with. It'll be a trigger because we don't want it to be blocking any movement, stuff like that. So this is going to have void on trigger enter, collider other, f other, compare tag. And you remember we specifically tagged the ball with the ball tag. So some of these things earlier on when I was setting them up, we hadn't actually put any use to them, but this was what the long-term plan was so that we could use them for stuff like this. Then we can say, hey, game manager. And then we can say apply effect. And then this is going to need to be able to tell us what type of effect to apply. And so there's different ways we could set up the item effects. I am inclined to go for making these a scriptable object. I think is going to be a good setup for this. So if the item effects are a scriptable object, and then this one inherits from base item effect, I think this will work quite nicely with what we're after. So that means our interactable item then actually has a base item effect, and it will tell the game manager, hey, apply this particular effect. And then I think when that happens, we want to destroy this game object. Because I think we're then done at that point. So the interactable item gets hit, disappears straight away. I think that will work quite nicely. So the game manager will get told to apply the effect. So it'll have apply effect, and it's going to be base item effect. Here's the particular one. Now I think we can keep in here a list of base item effect, player one effects. There's a new list of that, and we also then have base item effect, player two effects. I think that looks good. So we can have multiple things affecting the same one. Well, so multiple things could affect the same player, for example. So to work out which one it gets applied to, well, we know, if we remember, who last hit the ball. That was one of the things where so we can check that we've got an active ball. So the active ball, in this case I might do, now that should never happen, but just in case. So what we would do is, okay, well, active ball, and if we remember, we set this up to be keeping track of who it was last touched by. So we can now make this public, and it has public get, but a private set. And then we can say, well, active ball, last touched by, that was last touched by player one. Then this gets applied to player two's effects. Now we could also combine this into the effect as a potential option there of, okay, public bool applies to opponent, or maybe applies to last touched by. Actually, this could be applies to last touched by, or applies to opponent, because what this could be is this would allow us to have, just from the data, an effect apply to both potentially. So it could be something is super, super cursed and no one wants to touch the particular cursed object. So in this case, what we could say is, what I would be checking then is, okay, well, if the effect, if it applies to the last touched by, then we add it in like this. Else active ball, last touched by, because it could be that the ball has not been touched by anyone yet, that initial period where it's been launched. We don't want to penalize people in that case. So player one effects, add effect. So in this case, it applies to whoever last touched it. Apply to last person to touch ball. Otherwise, and we'd specifically now do a if, not an else if, applies to opponent. And let me fix this up because I got the order of those wrong, but they were conveniently correct by this. So applies to opponent. So this way, we can, just by changing our data, have an effect that could apply to us. So it could be something that's a beneficial, it could be a bonus, or it could be something that is detrimental. So if it applies to whoever last touched it, we're taking into account that. If it applies to our opponent, then it's based off of who the opponent is of whoever last touched the ball. So we add that effect in, so that works. Now, when we add those effects in, we want to be adding in a new copy of that. So we can do scriptable object instantiate, and we give it our effect. Just so we're not, we can have temporary data then, it's going to work a lot better. So this is good. We can apply the effects in. Well, effects could only, we might want the effects to only last for a particular time period. So with something like that, what we could do is in update, let's say we have a tick effects function, and that ticks player one effects because it's going to be the same logic. And rather than duplicating the logic, we'll just run it with different data. So we'd be able to tick our effects. That gets a list of base item effect. That works. So we can tick those. And what we would be saying is for each effect in effects, effect.tick. So I think we would then, in our base item effect here, and I think we would make this virtual, tick effect. So we would have here, because we don't need to have this accessible elsewhere, so I think we could have this be protected. So a serialized protected one that is duration. That's going to be our duration. And let's default it that all effects have a minimum duration of 5 seconds. Maybe 10 actually. I feel like 10 seconds is probably more what it needs to be. We can always adjust it, and this way we can customize it per effect as well. Just to double sure that this does not serialize. Time alive, or time active, I think might be a better term there. Time active, void, because then what we can do is time active plus equals time dot delta time. And then we can easily set up a helper here for our bool is active and it's active if time active is less than duration. Because the thing is, once we've done with an effect, we also need to be able to clean them out. So update the effects, remove any completed effects, because we don't want the things to be sticking around there if they're already done. So the way I would normally approach this is I would do a for loop that starts at the end, continues up to and including the first one, and we subtract our index, and then we would say if effects index is active, so we check if it's not active, then we can do effects remove at index. This way we don't need to do any further mucking around with our index, we just remove any ones that are completed. So that will work. That's a pretty solid setup there for our effects. If we want to then have these actually apply, so that's something where in our controls, if we think about how we want this to work, what we want is for the controls one, let's keep this fairly generic. We would have a if we go to our paddle, that's going to be the best way to work with this, because where this is going to apply is we want this to effectively invert our movement, is what we want to be able to do. So we would be able to, with this, I think this point here is where we would chuck this in. So we would be able to say input move is equal to game manager instance, and then we would say get apply effects, and we need to tell it which paddle we are. And the game manager, if you remember, already has a link to the paddle controllers, so it can identify who we are as well. So we tell it to apply effects, and this can be applying effects to our input. And then if we go to the game manager to figure out how we want this to look, so we know this has got to be a float. We know that this is taking in the paddle, and we know that it is taking in the current input. So what we would say then is, okay, well, if paddle, so let's go for effect stack. If paddle is equal to paddle left paddle, then we use paddle one effects, or player one effects. I'm going to rename these in a moment to left paddle effects, right paddle effects, I think will be better. Player two effects. This just allows us so that the rest of the code here doesn't need to care about which player it's actually for. Because then we would do for each effect in effect stack, and say return current input. We would do something here, I think, like current input is equal to effect dot modify input, and we give it that input. And then in our base one, it actually does nothing. So our base one is a public float modify input, current input, and it just returns it. This would allow us to then set up effects that slow down input. So we could have ones that slow it down or speed it up. But this just gives us a way of doing that control and it means the effects can chain together. And they chain together in the order of the oldest effect applies first, and then more recent ones apply later. So I'm going to rename this function modify input. So effects modify input, and what I also need to do is check if my mode is eGame mode classic, then I just return the current input so that there's no way for it to apply. One's in this case, and I could also do a similar thing here where apply effect if we don't have an active ball, or if the mode is equal to classic, then we do nothing, just so we don't potentially be applying effects outside of that. We can still keep the ticking, I think is fine because it's going to do nothing. So that's good. We've got our base item effect has this modify input. We'll make that virtual, because then what we do in our actual controls one is all this script becomes is this. Just makes it negative. So it flips the input. So it will invert the controls while it's active. So that looks pretty solid. We'll be able to apply those effects. We need to be able to create these items. So we need our create asset menu, and that we're going to need to be able to set that up. We can check because I never remember all of the parameters for it. So we have our menu name, file name, and order. So in this case, we have menu name, and that is going to be equal to, let's call that items, effect controls. We have our file name, item, effect controls. Good. So we'll be able to create that asset as well, which will be handy. So we can get this set up, and what I would be doing in this case is I will turn that item into a prefab in a moment. Firstly, I will item control curse, which I feel like the most appropriate color for that is going to be magenta. It is the generally the universal color of something's gone wrong, and I feel like there is nothing that symbolizes that better than mucking with the controls of the player. Should do the trick. So that'll be magenta for our control curse. And we can set up a folder for our data that'll have our item in it. So let's get our item set up. So effect controls. So that's good. So it applies to our opponent, lasts for 10 seconds. That looks good. Our control curse one links to that. That we can then turn this into a prefab that we'll place into the setup there. So that's good. And let's, for neatness again, just put this so we've got a better setup there. So that's pretty good. So what I'm going to do initially is just move this bit out of the way so that it's just sitting there, because we want to just be able to test if it works. We haven't done any spawning logic yet. That's fine. We want to just test if this actually works and kicks in. We should see the it trigger, it should be destroyed, and then at that point the controls should invert for whichever player last touched the ball. So controls are normal at the moment. That's been hit. And what it's actually done is player 2's controls are doing nothing. So player 2 actually had no control whatsoever. So let's take a look and make sure we didn't miss anything. So we've got current input is going through this. For in classic mode, we'll do nothing. So this is something where let's put in a breakpoint just so we can see what's potentially going wrong with this. And let's run this up again, because it did delete and it did cause an effect, because the one was not able to move. Now the challenge is I need to actually be able to play the game. So that should get it hitting it. So it's impacted. So we can see our current input at the moment is nothing. We particularly want to get a sense of when it ends up running this base one here is really what we're then looking for. And we could check what ends up happening in our paddle controller, because we can see that it is running that modify inputs. That looks fine. So this has got a value of 0, so that looks okay so far. Actually, what might be happening is it's possible that it's just forcing the input to 0, because, and it would force the input to 0, because what's happening is this would kick in and would flip the sign of what's happening. So I think what we would then do is we would need to look at how we want to change this. And I think we would actually have to move this, because down to here, if we did this change here, and we apply this when we actually get the input, then we're not flipping it every single time. So I think that would work better. So we only do this for if it's not AI controlled. That does then mean we need to think about, okay, well, how do we do this for the AI? Because the AI is subject to that movement with inertia as well. We want the AI to be properly sort of getting impacted as well. So we could, with that, be inverting this value. I think would probably do the trick. So we bring this up here. We take this logic and we would say, so we're letting it calculate the way that it normally would, but then we're inverting it. So this is our AI move command, and then we're inverting that. So I think that will work for the AI. So now what we're doing is we're not messing with the particular, that input variable. We're actually directly changing the input that we've got. So we're not flipping something continually, because remember that input variable only actually updates when our input changes. So this should give us a bit of a better behavior. So that is inverted. And then now it's returned back. So that's working. It is very confusing there. So at the moment we've got normal controls, so left moves up, And now left moves down and right moves up, so that's working. Let's make sure it messes with the AI a bit as well. Now, at the moment, it should mess with the AI even more. Now, the AI will need to change it here so that Paddle 2 is now AI controlled. I'm going to try and manage to have this actually work. There we go. Pretty happy with how the AI works, I'll be honest. It does a very solid job of beating me. There we go. So it's controls, and then that really messes it up. So we could give the AI some level of understanding of stuff like this if we wanted to allow it to be able to adapt and correct from that. But I think we're gonna leave that as an additional thing that could be added. Now the key thing is spawning these, because we don't want it to be manually placed in. We want to actually spawn these. And we'll leave that up to our game manager. So the game manager is going to serialize field, item spawn interval. Let's make it not too frequent. Next, item spawn time. So allow it to spawn ones right at the beginning. And let's keep a track of how many items. We don't want to have too many present there. Max items, and I think maybe 3. We want to keep it fairly low. We want to not have this get too overloaded, because then we will keep track of the spawned items. Okay, so we can then check FR mode is with items. So now we can bring the effect updating into here. We update the effects. Update spawn time. Next item spawn time, we subtract time delta time. If that's less than 0, then first thing we do is reset that. So we reset it to item spawn interval. And then what we can do is we might actually only want to update that when we've got space to actually spawn items. So maybe we check if spawned items dot count is less than max items, then we can update the spawn time and potentially spawn a new thing. So can we spawn? Do we have space to spawn? Spawn a new item. Then what we would do is here, let's have a spawn item function, which we'll set up in a moment. Spawn item. Read spawn item. So that will be instantiating a prefab. We also, when that item's consumed, we actually need to know. So game manager, we do apply effect. So we might actually change this to game manager consume item, and we say game object. So it might be at that point where we consume it that we destroy it. So we can apply the effect first. Game manager consumes it and will destroy the object. So that's good. Game manager has a public void consume item, and that consume item just gets the game object item, because what we do, spawned items, we remove that first, so we clean it up, and then we destroy it. clean up the item. So we're going to spawn the item. Well, first thing we need is we need a list of items we can spawn. So we're going to need game object, and it'll be a list. Actually, it can just be an array, game object, item prefabs. So that's good. So what it will do is first it'll pick an item to spawn. Item prefab. So item prefabs, random range, 0, item prefabs length. So we've picked an item. Now we need to pick where to spawn it. So we know we've got our collider. So we know we've got our spawn zone. And we've got the bounds for that. And we don't have a built-in thing there that'll just give us, okay, what is a random point within that? But we've got all of the information we need. And I think, pretty sure there isn't a... actually, there might be... No, I was hoping there would be one that would be within a particular box, but there's not, which is fine. But we can do a random range. We have our spawn zone, its bounds, and we can access its minimum, and we know this is going to be positioned somewhere in X and Z. So we can say it's minimum X to item spawn zone, bounds, max X. So this is going to be a vector 3 that is my spawn point. Spawn point is equal to new vector 3. We've got our X value. Y is easy. It's going to be 0. And then we have our Z value. Z. So we've picked a random spawn location. Pick a random spawn point. And then what we're going to do is we can just instantiate this prefab. So instantiate item prefab, can give it the location. So our spawn point. Rotation is just going to be the identity. And we can say spawned items, add in. Spawn the item. There we go. Our interactable item's got it set up for consuming the item. We'll need to link up our prefabs in the game manager. So we've got an issue with our consume items. Let's just check the problem there. So game manager is public void. Game manager.instance. There we go. So we'll consume it. We know that side is working. So we just need to link up our prefab, which we already set up that prefab. And this means that as we come up with new items, it's really easy to then add that into the game. We just add that in to our prefabs. So we should have this now spawning. And that is a hell of a location. I mean, see, when it's it doesn't get hit by a player, it just has no effect, and it's respawned. So we've got that behavior working, which is good. Now we just need it to be able to be something the player can select. So again, we can use our player pref keys. Public const string is with items. Game mode is with items. So we can then just check that. in start in the game manager. And we can just say here, because we've already got that check, so F player prefs dot get int player pref keys is with items, which will default that to off. But if it does have items, then our mode is equal to in-game mode with items. Otherwise, our mode is equal to e-game mode classic. So that's good. We've got that set up, and that will kick off the different things. I'm going to rename these as mentioned, left paddle effects, just for consistency with things. Right paddle effects. And then what I will do is in our main menu, we're going to have a couple of other options here. Player prefs, set int, player pref keys is with items, so we'll default that again to not being with items. And what we can do is let's switch back to our main menu, and we'll just look at a quick little bit of an adjustment to that so we can choose which sort of mode we're working in for that. So we'll save. So we could add in more buttons. Would be an option here with this. We could also have a look and potentially add in, we have a drop down, which let's bring this up to the top here, and let's make the size match. So that should be a size of 50. And we would need a bit of text above it as well. So mode label, mode drop down. So this would be controlling the game mode. And we want to have a spacer in here. So the mode drop down, we can see we need to update the text of that a little bit, because that text ends up being, with the increased size we did, ends up being a little bit small. So we need to make that larger. And then our items, we need to change the label text there to be a little bit larger as well. And then for configuring our options, we have to do that in code. So that's something where we can set those up in here. That's right. Classic and with power-ups. Then we can get rid of this option here. So we've got our game mode. And what we'll be able to do is in our main menu, we have a serialized field and drop down, TMP underscore drop down. Game mode. Oh. Now we don't need to hook up an event for this because we're actually checking it at this point. So we can just be checking if game mode picker, and then we can check its value, which is going to be the first thing that's being selected. We could also check the text. So we could check what text is displayed. In this case, if it's 0, then we do that. Otherwise, it's with items mode. We can set our mode, and then we just save. We do the same here. So that will allow us just to easily be able to select what game mode we want to play in. So we'll run this, and what I expect is with changing nothing and just clicking straight for human versus human, that I have my regular mode. And we can see we didn't link up our main menu to that drop down. So always make sure we link that up. So I have that linked. Then we go for human versus human, and we should see at no point. So we would have had a pickup spawn by now, which we don't. So that's good. So let's run this, and we'll check again the with items mode that we do get power-ups there, which we do, and we've got power-ups. So now we could easily set up a whole bunch of different modes if we wanted. I'm going to increase the size of these items here as well, just to make this look better. That should be good. Be 48. So we've just increased the size of everything a bit. We'll make it work a little bit nicer. And 200. Let's test that again, just to make sure this displays quite nicely for... There we go. So we've got our version of Pong, where we can set up our AI for it, and we could customize to have different AIs here. And we could easily road test our different AIs by having an AI play another one. We've set up some post-processing stuff to give a bit of a tweaked visual effect to it. We've also set up so we can have different game modes, and so we've tried to set this up in a way where we can easily customize and adjust this, where we can add in extra AIs or different AI behaviors by some fairly simple overriding of the logic, where we can add in extra game modes quite easily, where we can add in extra power-ups. So there's a lot of different things you could add to this. And again, that thing of encouraging you to experiment with adding stuff to this, do that. You've got the code, and you've got the code for the entire project. You can use that in any way that you want. So dive into it. Try adding in other items, other pickups. Try adding in stuff where, different AI behaviors. Look at trying to have the AI behave, react more intelligently to different pickups. There's lots of things you can add in there. Experiment with it. See the kinds of cool things you can add, and just, dive in. It'll be a lot of fun that you can be having there. Make some cool stuff. Thanks, folks. If you're looking for the code for the project, then in the description below, you'll find a link to the GitHub. And on the GitHub, I've got the code for this project and for all of the other projects. They're freely available. And if you have found the video helpful and you'd like to support the channel, then throwing in a like or subscribing is always a huge help. If you're looking for further ways to support, then I do have a Patreon set up, and that's going to help me keep managing to do these videos for a long time to come, which is going to help more people make cool things. And that's awesome, because that's what this is all about, is helping more people make more cool things. And that is all. Thank you.